Jasper was 20, and he was hollow. It wasn't a dramatic kind of emptiness, not the kind that screamed for attention or manifested in loud outbursts of rebellion. It was the quiet, steady hum of a radio tuned to a dead frequency, a persistent, low-level white noise that had become the ambient soundtrack of his existence. He had come to his uncle's ranch in Wyoming, not with a grand plan to find himself. He wasn't sure there was enough of a self left to find, but with a desperate, visceral need to be lost. He craved a geography so massive and so profoundly indifferent that it could swallow the specific, jagged shape of his loneliness without leaving a ripple on the surface. He wanted to be a speck in a landscape that didn't demand he be a person. Back in the city, his life had been a frantic, claustrophobic blur of crowded rooms where he felt like an uninvited guest at his own party. He lived through neon lights that flickered with a nervous, artificial energy, reflecting off wet pavement and steel and glass towers that seemed to touch the clouds without ever reaching heaven. His conversations had felt like scripts he hadn't quite memorized, filled with trendy jargon, performative apathy, and shallow ironies that tasted like ash in his mouth. Every interaction felt like a transaction of social currency he didn't possess. He was a creature of the periphery, a ghost drifting through minimalist galleries and thumping underground clubs, always watching the pulse of the world through a glass barrier, but never feeling it hammer in his own veins. The city was a place where everyone was seen, but nobody was known, and Jasper had grown tired of being a shadow among shadows. Here, in the high desert of the West, the landscape was a revelation of scale that bordered on the terrifying. The Wyoming sky didn't just exist, it loomed. It was a vast blue cathedral, vaulted by clouds that looked like carved marble, and it didn't care about his secrets, his city-born anxieties, or his lack of purpose. The silence here wasn't an absence of sound, it was a heavy, physical presence, a thick texture made of the earth breathing through the sagebrush and the constant mournful whistling of the wind through the lodgepole pines. It was a silence that demanded you look inward whether you wanted to or not. It stripped away the noise of the city until all that was left was the raw, uncomfortable reality of his own heartbeat. The wind didn't just blow, it scoured, taking with it the layers of artifice Jasper had spent years perfecting. Then there was Henry. Henry didn't walk. He moved with a grounded, rhythmic certainty that suggested the tectonic plates themselves shifted just to accommodate the fall of his boots. He was 26, but he carried the gravity of a man who had lived 3 lifetimes, his shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the entire ranch without a groan. His skin was the color of well-oiled leather, tanned and cured by a decade of unrelenting sun and biting frost, and his eyes were the shade of flint, sharp, cold, and capable of sparking a fire if struck with the right kind of steel. There was a stillness to him that was more active than most people's movement, a quiet power that commanded the space around him. He was the lead hand on the ranch, a man who spoke in fragments and lived in the wide-open spaces between sentences. To Jasper, who had grown up surrounded by the ephemeral, the plastic, and the temporary, Henry was an impossible force of nature. He was as immovable as the granite peaks of the Tetons, and to Jasper's city-soft sensibilities, he was twice as intimidating. Henry didn't need to explain himself. He simply was, rooted to the soil in a way Jasper had never been rooted to anything. While Jasper was made of neon and vapor, a creature of fleeting trends and shifting moods, Henry was made of iron and bone, a man forged by the hard logic of the seasons. The first time their hearts truly collided wasn't through a look or a word, but through the visceral, bone-deep reality of shared labor. A fence line had gone down near the creek after a sudden spring flash flood had turned a gentle stream into a brown, roiling snake that tore at the earth and uprooted ancient willows. Jasper, still clumsy and painfully self-conscious in his stiff, store-bought boots, had been sent to help Henry haul the heavy, rusted rolls of barbed wire across the muddy flats. The mud was a thick, sucking sludge that threatened to pull the boots right off Jasper's feet, making every step an exhausting battle of wills against the mire. "Hold the post," Henry said. His voice wasn't a request or an invitation. It was a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in Jasper's very marrow, settling somewhere deep in his solar plexus like a heavy stone. Jasper gripped the cedar post, the rough, damp bark biting into his uncalloused palms. He leaned his entire weight against it, his knuckles turning a stark, bloodless white against the wood. He could feel the tremors of the earth as Henry approached, mallet in hand, his movements as economical as they were powerful. Henry swung the mallet. It was a terrifying, graceful dance of physics and raw muscle. Every time the heavy iron head struck the wood, the shock traveled up Jasper's arms, rattling his teeth and settling in his chest like a heartbeat that wasn't his own. He felt the raw power of the man through the medium of the wood, an undeniable transmission of strength that left him breathless and strangely tethered. With every strike, Jasper felt the vibration echoing in his lungs, a rhythmic reminder that he was finally, physically part of something. In the heat of the midday sun, Jasper looked up, squinting against the glare that bounced off the wire. He caught a bead of sweat as it escaped the brim of Henry's battered Stetson, rolling down the corded muscle of his neck and disappearing into the salt-stained collar of a denim shirt that had faded to the color of a summer sky. The shirt smelled of cedar, old tobacco, the sharp tang of iron, and a raw, masculine heat that made Jasper's head swim. It was an honest smell, devoid of the synthetic citrusy colognes Jasper was used to back home. It smelled like the earth itself. Henry caught him looking. He didn't look away with the polite, evasive embarrassment of a city dweller. Instead, he stared back, his gaze heavy, unblinking, and strangely curious, as if he were trying to read a map of a city he'd never visited. As he reached out to adjust the tension of the wire, his thumb grazed the back of Jasper's hand. The touch was brief, a mere second of skin against skin, but it felt like a brand, a sudden surge of heat that made Jasper's breath hitch. It was an accidental intimacy that felt more deliberate than any touch Jasper had ever experienced. "You're shaking, kid," Henry noted. There was no mockery in his tone, just a flat, terrifyingly honest observation that stripped Jasper's defenses bare. He wasn't teasing, he was simply stating a fact of Jasper's biology. "It's just the cold," Jasper lied, his voice cracking like dry timber under a heavy load. The Wyoming wind was indeed biting, tearing through his thin city jacket, but the heat radiating off Henry was enough to melt the frost on the sagebrush for yards around. Jasper felt the heat rising in his own face, a flush that had nothing to do with the temperature. "Sure," Henry murmured, his eyes lingering on Jasper's mouth for a fraction of a heartbeat longer than necessary, a look that suggested he saw right through the lie and into the trembling center of Jasper's soul. The cold. A week later, a late spring storm brought a heavy, freezing rain that drummed relentlessly against the bunkhouse roof, a rhythmic percussion that kept Jasper staring at the rafters. One of the mares, a beautiful, high-strung gray named Stella, was showing signs of distress during her pregnancy, and Henry took the midnight shift in the barn to keep watch. Jasper, unable to sleep in the drafty bunkhouse, his mind racing with images of flint-gray eyes and denim-clad shoulders, found himself drawn to the flickering yellow glow of the barn windows. He found Henry sitting in the hay, a lantern cast low, creating a circle of warm amber in the cavernous, shadowy barn. Henry had his shirt off, the heavy fabric draped over a nearby rail, using it to rub down the shivering horse. His bare torso was a landscape of shadowed muscle and old scars, his skin glistening with the sweat of his labor and the dampness of the air. The sight was so raw, so intimately masculine that Jasper nearly turned back, feeling like he'd stumbled into a private prayer. But Henry didn't scold him or tell him to leave. He just nodded toward an overturned bucket. "Sit. The heat from the horses keeps it warm enough in here." They sat in the dark for hours, the only sound the rhythmic chewing of hay, the soft snorts of the horses, and the drum of rain on the tin roof. The atmosphere was thick with the scent of damp wool and animal warmth. Henry spoke about the stars, how they looked different when you were high enough to touch them, away from the light pollution of the valley. He spoke about the land not as an adversary to be conquered, but as a living thing that demanded respect and paid its debts in kind. For the first time, Jasper saw the man behind the cowboy, the quiet dreamer who hid behind the stone mask of the ranch hand. "Sometimes," Henry whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain, "sometimes I think the sky is the only thing that actually listens without judging. It's got no opinion on who you're supposed to be." Jasper looked at Henry's profile, the sharp line of his jaw and the sudden unmasked vulnerability in his gaze, and realized that for the first time in his life, he was really listening to someone too. The walls of the city had never felt so far away. Summer began with a difficult birth that tested the limits of their endurance and their bond. A young heifer was struggling in the south pasture as a thick heat haze began to settle over the valley, making the air feel heavy and unmoving. Henry called for Jasper's help, not having time to find the more experienced hands who were out of checking the upper fences. It was messy, raw, and terrifying, a visceral encounter with the cycle of life that Jasper was entirely unprepared for in his sterile city upbringing. Jasper had to reach in, his hands guided by Henry's steady, large ones, to help reposition the calf. Henry was right behind him, his chest pressed against Jasper's back, his arms reaching around to provide the strength Jasper lacked. The smell of blood, earth, and sweat was overwhelming, a primal sensory assault. "Focus, Jasper," Henry breathed into his ear, his voice a steady anchor in the chaos. "Steady hands. She's counting on us to get this right." Jasper could feel the heat of Henry's body, the way their breathing began to synchronize as they worked in the dirt. When the calf finally breathed, falling with a wet, heavy thud into the long grass, both men were covered in blood and birth fluid, their chests heaving as they breathed as hard as the animals. They knelt in the dirt together, their shoulders touching, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away to leave a profound, exhausted peace that felt like a secret they'd forged in the mud. Henry looked at Jasper, a smear of mud on his cheek and his hair matted with sweat, and smiled, not the polite, guarded smile of a ranch hand, but something primal, shared, and deeply personal. "You did good, Jasper," Henry whispered, his voice thick with an unexpected pride. He reached out and wiped the mud from Jasper's face, his thumb lingering on Jasper's lower lip for a heartbeat too long, the friction sending a jolt through Jasper's entire body. The intimacy of the moment was sharper than any words, a bridge built in the muck of the pasture that neither of them could ignore. Jasper felt the phantom pressure of that thumb for the rest of the day, a mark that went deeper than the skin. By mid-June, the spring rains had vanished entirely, replaced by a relentless dry heat that turned the valley into a shimmering kiln. The air was thick with the scent of parched grass, hot dust, and the metallic tang of the sun on the fence wire. They were clearing irrigation ditches near the north boundary, a back-breaking task under a sun that felt like a white-hot hammer beating against their skulls. Henry stopped mid-shovelful, his breath coming in heavy, rhythmic drags that showed the strain even on him. Without a word, he set the shovel aside and began unbuttoning his denim shirt, casting it into the tall grass. His skin was a deep mahogany bronze, glistening with a fine sheen of sweat that caught the noon light like gold. Every movement of his arms sent ripples across his back and chest, a display of functional strength that Jasper found impossible to look away from. Henry's body wasn't built for aesthetics, it was built for survival, and that made it infinitely more beautiful to Jasper. "Shirt's only gonna hold the heat in, Jasper," Henry said, wiping his brow with the back of his hand and looking at Jasper with a challenge in his eyes. "Take it off before you pass out. I ain't hauling you back on a mule because of heat stroke. The uncle would never let me hear the end of it." Jasper hesitated, acutely aware of the contrast between his pale, lean frame, the product of 1,000 hours under fluorescent lights, and Henry's rugged, sun-hewn power. Slowly, he pulled his t-shirt over his head. The air hit his damp skin with a sudden, cooling shock, but it was Henry's gaze that made him shiver. Henry wasn't looking at the mountains or the ditches anymore.
He was looking at the lean definition of Jasper's ribs, at the way his heart was visibly thudding against his sternum, and the way the sun picked out the fine, delicate lines of his collarbone. Henry stepped closer, ostensibly to reach for the water jug sitting between them in the dirt. His bare arm brushed against Jasper's side, a searing contact of skin on skin, warm, damp, and impossibly firm. Jasper's breath hitched, the tension between them thick enough to taste in the dusty air, a heavy weight that made the vastness of the field feel small. They stood there for a long moment, the only sound the cicadas' shrill, desperate buzz, trapped in the gravity of their own unspoken desire. Henry's eyes darkened, a flash of pure, unadulterated hunger crossing his face before he grunted and turned back to the ditch, the shovel biting into the earth with renewed, frustrated violence as he tried to dig his way out of the feeling.
Henry announced they needed to check the salt licks on the high ridge, a task that required a long, steep climb into the foothills where the air was thinner and the world felt remote. It was a 4-hour ride each way, a task usually reserved for the younger, more expendable hands, but Henry insisted on taking Jasper. To the other hands, it was a chore. To Jasper, it felt like a secret they were keeping from the rest of the world, a day stolen from the timeline of the ranch. They rode in a comfortable silence, the only sound the rhythmic creak of leather, the soft thud of hooves on dry earth, and the occasional lonely call of a mountain bluebird. When they finally reached the ridge, the world fell away. They could see the entire valley laid out like a map, a patchwork of green and gold stitched together by the silver thread of the creek. From up here, the problems of the world seemed like nothing more than dust motes in the sun. They sat on a flat outcrop of granite to eat their meager lunch of dried beef and apples. Henry sat with his legs dangling over the edge, completely at home in the dizzying height, his hat tipped back. Jasper sat a few feet away, feeling the precariousness of everything, the height, the silence, and the man beside him who seemed to embody the mountain itself. "Small ain't always bad," Henry said, turning to look at him, his eyes softened by the vastness of the view. He reached out and, with a startling gentleness that contrasted with his rugged exterior, brushed a stray piece of mountain grass from Jasper's hair. His fingers lingered near Jasper's temple, the calloused tips scratching softly against his skin. Sometimes being small just means you're easier to hold on to when the wind picks up. Sometimes it means you're the only thing that matters in a place this big. Jasper felt his throat tighten, a lump forming that made it hard to swallow. He wanted to lean into that hand, to let the mountain man anchor him to the earth and never let go. He wanted to tell Henry that he'd never felt more important than he did in that moment, but the words felt too heavy for the thin air. The longing in that silence was a physical ache, a bridge they were both too afraid to cross. But the moment passed as Henry pulled back, his jaw tightening as he looked back toward the ranch, the weight of his duty and his reputation returning to his shoulders like a leaden cloak. The 4th of July wasn't celebrated with fireworks or parades on the ranch. The animals were too skittish for that. Instead, it was a rare half-day of rest. The heat was stifling, the air thick and stagnant with the smell of parched sage and wood smoke from distant wildfires. Henry suggested they go down to a secluded bend in the creek where the water pooled deep and cold beneath the shade of ancient, gnarled cottonwoods. They arrived at the water's edge, the dust of a month's work clinging to their skin like a second layer of clothing. Henry didn't hesitate. He kicked off his boots and shed his jeans, standing in the dappled sunlight in nothing but his boxers. Jasper followed suit, his heart racing with a mix of excitement and a new, sharp kind of nerves. He'd seen Henry half-naked before, but the context of leisure felt different, more dangerous. They waded into the water together. The shock of the cold was a sensory explosion that made Jasper gasp and laugh, a sound that felt foreign coming from his own throat. Henry laughed too, a rare, bright sound that echoed off the surface of the pool and made the woods feel alive. Soon, they were splashing each other like children, the weight of their roles and the expectations of the town temporarily forgotten in the sanctuary of the trees.
For a few minutes, they weren't the cowboy and the city boy. They were just two people in the water. But then they stopped. They were standing waist deep in the pool, the water swirling around them, cooling their heated skin. Henry reached out, his hand wet and cool, and rested it on Jasper's bare shoulder. He pulled Jasper closer until they were standing chest to chest, their breathing synchronized in the quiet. The contrast was stark. Henry's dark, rugged strength against Jasper's lithe, pale grace. Jasper could feel the individual droplets of water on Henry's skin. Henry's hand moved from Jasper's shoulder to the back of his neck, his thumb tracing the sensitive skin behind his ear with agonizing slowness. "Jasper," he whispered, his voice a ragged edge of desire and fear, a sound that seemed to come from the very depths of him. He looked at Jasper as if he were seeing him for the first time and for the last time, his eyes searching for an answer to a question he hadn't asked. "Then don't think," Jasper whispered, his hands finding the firm, wet muscles of Henry's lower back, pulling him closer. He closed the distance until their noses brushed, the world narrowing down to the space between their lips. A hawk shrieked overhead, a sharp, piercing cry that broke the silence of the woods and the spell between them like a glass ornament hitting the floor. Henry pulled back, a look of sudden, intense panic crossing his features, as if he'd just woken up on the edge of a cliff. He waded out of the water and began dressing in a feverish, silent hurry, the emotional distance returning like an iron shutter being slammed shut. He didn't look at Jasper for the rest of the day, leaving the silence to grow between them like a wall. Mid-July brought the peak of the drought, the grass turning to brittle straw under a relentless sun that seemed determined to bleach the color out of the world. The ranch's old Ford broke down 3 miles from the main house while they were hauling supplies to the far corral. The hood was up, the engine radiating a punishing, metallic heat that made the air shimmer and dance. Henry was bent over the engine block, shirtless again to avoid ruin. Grease streaked across his chest, stomach, and arms in jagged patterns. He was frustrated, his muscles tensing as he struggled with a stubborn, rusted bolt, cursing softly under his breath in a low, rhythmic way that made Jasper's pulse quicken. Jasper stood by, holding the flashlight as the sun began to set, casting long, orange shadows across the dusty, rutted road. "Hand me that wrench," Henry grunted, not looking up from the oily depths of the engine. As Jasper leaned in to hand it over, their chests brushed, skin on skin, slick with sweat and oil. Henry stopped. The air around them seemed to vanish, replaced by a vacuum of intensity. He looked at Jasper, his eyes dark, hungry, and haunted by a conflict that was tearing him apart. He reached out with a grease-stained hand and gripped the back of Jasper's neck, pulling him in until their foreheads touched. Jasper could smell the gasoline, the sweat, and the raw, unrefined desperation of the moment. "You're killing me, Jasper," Henry breathed, his voice a low, painful rasp that vibrated through Jasper's skull. "I can't breathe when you're around, and I can't breathe when you're not. I'm a man who knows how to fix things, but I don't know how to fix this. I don't know how to fix me." He let go as suddenly as he had grabbed him, throwing the wrench into the dirt in a fit of pure frustration that echoed in the silence. They walked the 3 miles back to the ranch in a silence that was louder than the engine had ever been, their shadows stretching out before them like giants, never quite touching, though their hands brushed against each other in the dark. The 1st of August was the county fair, the one time of year the whole valley came together in a dizzying display of livestock, funnel cakes, and rigid tradition. Henry was entered in the roping competition, a display of the skills he'd spent a lifetime perfecting. Jasper watched from the stands, his heart in his throat as Henry moved with a brutal, efficient grace, his horse an extension of his own body. He looks like the very ideal of the West, strong, silent, and capable of handling anything with a rope and a steady hand. He was the hero the town wanted, and Jasper felt the weight of that expectation. Afterwards, they walked the midway as the sun went down and the neon lights of the Ferris wheel began to glow, casting strange, colorful shadows. Henry bought Jasper a beer and a funnel cake, and they sat on the tailgate of the truck on the far edge of the grounds, away from the noise, the music, and the prying eyes of the neighbors who knew Henry's name. "I saw you looking at me out there," Henry said, his voice low and cautious, watching the distant lights. "Everyone was looking at you, Henry," Jasper replied, picking at the powdered sugar on his shirt, feeling the distance between Henry the legend and Henry the man. "You were incredible. You looked like you belonged there." "I don't care about everyone." Henry reached out and took Jasper's hand, lacing their fingers together in the deep, protective shadows between the trucks. For 20 minutes they sat like that, their palms pressed together, a silent, public yet private acknowledgement of the gravity pulling them together. It was a terrifying risk, a declaration made in the dark, and the danger of it made Jasper's blood sing a song he had never heard before. The emotional distance between them grew into a canyon over the next 2 weeks as the reality of their situation and the approaching harvest began to settle in. Henry became a ghost, appearing only for essential work and avoiding the bunkhouse entirely, sleeping in the hayloft to the tack room. The breaking point came the night of the local harvest dance, a celebration of the first crops that demanded a social performance neither was ready for. Jasper stood on the fringes of the community hall, the music sounding like discord in his ears. He watched Henry laugh with a local rancher's daughter, a girl who looked like she belonged on Henry's arm in a way Jasper never would, someone who shared his history and his heritage. Jealousy hit him like a physical blow, a hot, sick feeling in his gut that made the room spin. He couldn't stand the sight of the performance. He retreated to the darkness of the stables, needing the silence of the animals and the smell of hay to ground him before he shattered. Henry followed him 5 minutes later, the barn door creaking with the weight of his arrival. "I saw you leave, again. You can't keep running every time things get real." "Go back to your girl, Henry. She fits the story. She's the future everyone expects for you. She's the daughter of a rancher, not a city kid who doesn't know a heifer from a steer and never will. You're trying to live 2 lives, and it's killing me." "It's dangerous, Jasper," Henry growled, stepping into his space until they were inches apart in the dark. "His life, the people here, they don't forgive mistakes like us. They'll run us both out on a rail if they knew what I was thinking when I look at you. They'll take the ranch, the name, everything." "Is that all I am? A mistake to be hidden?" Jasper shouted, his voice echoing in the rafters. Henry didn't answer with words. He growled, a low, animal sound of pure frustration, and slammed Jasper against the wooden stall, his hands gripping Jasper's shoulders with a bruising strength. "I'm afraid," Henry whispered, his face inches from Jasper's, his eyes wild. "I'm afraid that once I taste you, the rest of this life, the ranch, the tradition, the duty will taste like nothing but dust. I'm afraid I'll never want to go back to being the man they want. And I don't know who I am without that man." He held him there, their heartbeats thudding against each other like trapped birds before pulling away with a look of pure, unadulterated agony. "Go back to the hall, Jasper, before I do something we both can't survive, before I burn this whole place down." The storm broke in late August, a prehistoric blizzard that swept down from the mountains with a sudden, icy vengeance, catching them as they were checking the north pastures. The world turned white in seconds, erasing the horizon. They were forced to take shelter in the Northline cabin, a tiny, drafty shack meant for emergencies that felt like a lifeboat in a frozen sea. They had 1 narrow bunk and 3 thin wool blankets to survive a night that promised to be deadly. "Just get in the bed, Henry. It's for survival," Jasper said, his teeth already chattering as the temperature plummeted and the wind began to howl through the cracks in the logs. "Don't let your pride kill us both." They lay side by side, shoulders pressed together, their breaths visible in the freezing air. 2 small points of heat in a vast, cold world. The intimacy was forced by the cold, but it was real in a way nothing else had been. "Talk to me," Jasper whispered into the dark, his voice trembling. Henry finally broke his long silence, confessing the walls he'd built, brick by brick, since he was a small boy, the crushing expectations of his father, the weight of being the perfect ranch hand, the fear of being found wanting. "I thought I was safe in the silence," Henry whispered, his hand finding Jasper's. "I thought if I didn't say it, it wasn't true. And then you walked right through the gate like it wasn't even there, and you looked at me like you knew everything I was hiding." Jasper found Henry's hand under the wool blankets. This time, Henry didn't pull away. He gripped it with a desperate, crushing strength, as if Jasper were the only thing keeping him from drifting away. As the fire in the small stove died down to glowing embers, Henry turned on his side, his large, rough hand tracing the curve of Jasper's cheek with a reverence that made Jasper's breath catch. "You're the only beautiful thing I've ever really looked at," he breathed. "The only thing that feels like it's mine." It wasn't a night of lust, but of profound, soul-deep recognition. The hollow goy and the stone man were made of the same searching, fragile clay, and for one night, they didn't have to be anything else. They fell asleep tangled together, their heat the only thing keeping the winter at bay, a small defiance against the storm. The snow eventually relented, leaving a world that looked dangerously new, scrubbed clean by the ice, but the summons had finally come from the city. Jasper's uncle was demanding his return to settle the final details of the estate. Jasper stood by his truck, his city suitcases looking absurdly out of place, shiny and clean against the mud-splattered tires and the rugged, unforgiving Wyoming backdrop. "I have to go, Henry. The lawyers, the house. If I don't sign those papers, I lose the only thing my parents left me. I don't have a choice." Henry stood by the gate, his jaw set in that familiar, stone-hard line that had intimidated Jasper on the first day, but his eyes were filled with a raw, exposed pain that made Jasper want to stay forever. "A man's got to take care of business. Duty is duty. I know that better than most." "Will you be here when I come back, or will the mountain have closed up again?" Jasper asked, his voice trembling as he reached for the door handle. Henry stepped forward, bridging the final gap between their worlds. He reached into his pocket and pressed a piece of raw, weathered turquoise on a hand-tooled leather cord into Jasper's palm. He closed Jasper's fingers over it with his own large, warm hand. "My mother gave me this when I was 10. She said it'll always lead you back to where you belong, no matter how far the road goes or how dark the night gets. Take it, so you don't forget the color of the sky out here, so you remember who you were in the barn." "Henry, go, before I lose my nerve and ask you to stay. But Jasper, don't stay away too long. The silence gets real loud when there's no one around to share it. I don't think I can go back to being a mountain anymore. I've forgotten how to be made of stone." Jasper climbed into the truck, clutching the turquoise as if it were a lifeline connecting him to the earth. As he drove away, watching Henry in the rearview mirror until he was just a speck against the vast, eternal Wyoming horizon, he realized he wasn't going back to the city to live his old life. He was going back to close a door so he could come back and finally walk through the gate for good.